They called it the heart of the empire. But in truth, it was a cage deep within the palaces of the Ottoman sultans. Behind gilded doors and shadowed corridors, there existed a world unseen by the common people. A world where beauty was currency, and youth itself was devoured by power. This was the imperial harem, not merely a place of concubines and wives, as the history books would have you believe. It was a labyrinth of silken rooms, locked chambers, and forbidden rituals. A machine built not only to satisfy pleasure, but to control bloodlines, manipulate politics, and trap souls in a cycle of desire and despair. And at the center of it all, were the young slaves, boys taken from conquered lands, stripped of their pasts, reshaped into ornaments of the Sultan's court. Some would rise to influence, wielding power through whispered intimacy. Others would vanish into the shadows, their names erased, their bodies broken beneath the weight of a system that demanded silence. This is not the story they tell in classrooms. This is the rotting heart of the Ottoman Empire, where human lives were currency, and where lust became an empire's most dangerous weapon. The Ottoman war machine did not only harvest land, gold, and tribute. It harvested flesh. Every campaign into Europe, the Balkans, or the distant steppes brought with it more than just prisoners of war. Among the chained masses, the empire's agents searched with predatory eyes, choosing not the strongest soldiers, but the youngest and most beautiful captives. Boys with sharp features, skin unscarred by battle, and eyes that still carry the fire of youth were torn from their families. For them, there would be no battlefield glory, no ransom to bring them home. Instead, they were marched in silence toward the palace, destined to serve not as warriors, but as ornaments of pleasure. These youths were stripped of their names, their languages beaten out of them, their histories dissolved like sand. To the Sultan and his court, they were not sons, not brothers, not individuals, only offerings. Their beauty was a resource, their innocence a weapon, their obedience a necessity. Behind the shimmering walls of Topkapi, they became property. Some would be raised to serve in ceremonies, their elegance displayed like art. Others would be pushed into darker corridors, prepared to become objects of secrecy, their bodies sacrificed in silence to sustain the endless hunger of power. In the Ottoman Empire, conquest did not end on the battlefield. It continued in the bedchambers of the Sultan. Inside the gilded walls of the Ottoman palace, beauty was not celebrated, it was dissected, judged, and consumed. From the endless stream of war captives, a cruel ritual unfolded. The selection. Court officials and eunuchs paraded rows of trembling youths, their faces pale under torchlight, their bodies inspected as if they were livestock. A turn of the chin, a brush of hair away from the eyes, the faintest sign of symmetry, these details could decide whether a boy vanished into obscurity, or was condemned to the Sultan's harem. There was no dignity in this ceremony. Boys were stripped of clothing, their bodies scrutinized for perfection. A scar could mean rejection, a flaw could mean punishment. But those deemed too beautiful to waste faced an even crueler fate, life inside the inner chambers, where their freedom ended before it even began. Some cried, some resisted, none escaped. The chosen were dressed in silk, renamed in the Sultan's tongue, and paraded like rare treasures. Yet beneath the glitter of jewels and the perfumed air, they were prisoners, trapped in a cage of velvet. For every smile forced upon their lips, a piece of their soul was cut away. The Ottomans called it refinement. History remembers it as ritualized cruelty. They were neither fully men, nor fully free. The eunuchs of the Ottoman court stood as living boundaries between the Sultan's harem and the outside world. Their very bodies had been mutilated, their masculinity stolen, so they could serve as trustworthy guardians of the empire's most intimate secrets. But their role was more sinister than just guarding doors. The eunuchs became the handlers of young concubines, boys taken from war, stripped of names and homes, reshaped into creatures of obedience. It was the eunuchs who inspected them, Who trained them in gestures of submission? Who reminded them that resistance was meaningless? They whispered the rules of survival: never meet the Sultan's eyes unless summoned. Never refuse his touch. Never speak of what happens in the dark chambers. In this way, the eunuchs were both jailers and tutors. Their scarred bodies symbolized what awaited anyone who dared to transgress. Every boy who passed through their hands learned a single, unshakable truth: the Sultan's will was law, and their own desires were nothing. Behind every locked door, every silken curtain, the eunuchs lingered in silence, watching, listening, ensuring that forbidden passions remained chained. They were not protectors. They were reminders. Living monuments of castration and control. In the Ottoman Harem, purity was obsession. Not just for women, young male concubines, stolen from villages and battlefields, were also subjected to rituals of control. Before being presented to the Sultan, each boy was forced to undergo humiliating examinations. Their bodies were treated not as human, but as property, flesh to be inspected, judged, and broken into obedience. Every breath, every movement, was scrutinized under the cold gaze of eunuchs and physicians. For the boys, it was not about innocence, it was about ownership. The empire wanted to ensure that no secret touch, no hidden desire, had marked them before they entered the Sultan's chambers. Their value was tied to their untouched bodies, as if purity itself could be weighed and sold. But the cruelty did not end with the examination. The humiliation lingered. Each boy knew that his dignity had been stripped before he had even taken a step into the harem. From that moment on, his body was no longer his own. It was a canvas for the Sultan's will. For the empire, this was order. For the boys, it was the first taste of a life where shame would be their constant companion. In the Ottoman Harem, purity was obsession. Not just for women, young male concubines, stolen from villages and battlefields, were also subjected to rituals of control. Before being presented to the Sultan, each boy was forced to undergo humiliating examinations. Their bodies were treated not as human, but as property, flesh to be inspected, judged, and broken into obedience. Every breath, every movement, was scrutinized under the cold gaze of eunuchs and physicians. For the boys, it was not about innocence, it was about ownership. The empire wanted to ensure that no secret touch, no hidden desire, had marked them before they entered the Sultan's chambers. Their value was tied to their untouched bodies, as if purity itself could be weighed and sold. But the cruelty did not end with the examination. The humiliation lingered. Each boy knew that his dignity had been stripped before he had even taken a step into the harem. From that moment on, his body was no longer his own. It was a canvas for the Sultan's will. For the empire, this was order. For the boys, it was the first taste of a life where shame would be their constant companion. In the empire's most secret chambers, sex was never just pleasure, it was ritual, a theater of dominance. Every touch, every breath, every body was a symbol. For the Sultan, intimacy was not private, it was political. Young male concubines were often drawn into ceremonies that blurred the line between devotion and desecration. Before the Sultan's throne, they were made to kneel, their presence a living offering. The act itself became a proclamation: here is proof of absolute power. Here is the body of the conquered. These rituals carried layers of meaning. To command another's flesh was to command his spirit. To display a submissive youth was to remind courtiers and rivals alike that the Sultan's authority reached beyond life and law, it reached into the most intimate corners of existence. Some of these ceremonies took place during banquets, where the Sultan's chosen boys performed in silence before the eyes of generals and viziers. Others were hidden, reserved for only the closest inner circle, where the line between religion, politics, and desire dissolved into one spectacle of control. In such rituals, the young concubine ceased to be human. He became a vessel of the Sultan's might, a silent stage on which power itself was performed. And in the empire's memory, these ceremonies left behind not love, Not beauty, but the chilling reminder that even desire can be weaponized as a tool of rule. History remembers rulers for their conquests, their laws, their palaces. But behind the velvet curtains of the harem, some sultans carved their legacy in darker ways. Pleasure, for them, was never simple. It had to be twisted, exaggerated, transformed into spectacle. Young male concubines, chosen for beauty, obedience, and silence, were often the canvas for these obsessions. Some rulers demanded elaborate performances, youths costumed like mythic gods, forced to reenact stories of conquest and submission. Their bodies painted in gold dust until they shimmered like living statues. Others indulged in cruel games, measuring loyalty not through words, but through the endurance of humiliation. There were sultans who preferred the fragile innocence of the newly captured, savoring fear as much as desire. And there were those who staged entire nights of decadence, surrounding themselves with dozens of boys, not out of need, but to prove abundance, to show the empire that nothing, not even desire, was beyond their reach. These habits were whispered of, never recorded in official chronicles. Yet they lingered in the walls of the palaces. Servants carried rumors, survivors carried scars, and history itself carried the stain. What remained was not just the memory of cruelty, but the terrifying truth. For some sultans, lust was never about the body. It was about domination, about turning the human soul into nothing more than another jewel in the crown. In the imperial harem, desire was dangerous, not just because of the bodies it consumed, but because of the secrets it created. What happened behind those locked doors was never meant to leave them. And when whispers threatened to slip beyond the gilded walls, poison became the final word. Silent powders, poured into a cup of sherbet, oils, massaged into the skin until breath faltered, even perfumes, sweet and deadly, designed to erase not just life, but memory. For those who knew too much, concubines, eunuchs, even young favorites, death was not always quick. Sometimes, it was an erasure stretched over days, their bodies wasting away until only silence remained. There were other methods, darker still. Certain rulers feared betrayal so deeply that they destroyed the very tools of pleasure. Bodies were mutilated, voices broken, beauty ruined, so that no secret could ever tempt its way into the world. A cruel paradox: the same youths once treasured like rare jewels were discarded, shattered, when they became a threat. The walls of the harem absorbed it all, the sighs of indulgence, the cries of agony, the silence of the poisoned. History rarely writes these stories, but they survive in fragments, in the faint echo of warning, in the palace of power. Lust was never private. It was a secret heavy enough to kill. When the gates of the imperial harems finally closed, their walls did not stay silent. They had absorbed centuries of whispers, of lust, of cruelty, of hunger for control. And though the stones crumbled, their shadows spilled outward, staining the pages of history. The legacy was not love. It was not beauty. It was fear, control, and the grotesque bending of human bodies and desires. Generations of young men and women, stolen, caged, consumed, were reduced to ghosts in forgotten chronicles. Their stories were rewritten as myths of exotic pleasure. But the truth was far darker. Harems were machines, grinding flesh and spirit into dust to preserve the illusion of a ruler's divine power. Eunuchs, concubines, slaves, their suffering was recycled into legend. The perfumes, the silks, the golden chambers, all served to mask a truth too disturbing for polite history to speak aloud. Yet that truth lingers, haunting every ruin, every faded tapestry, every broken seal of an empire long gone. This is the inheritance left behind, not glory, but a warning. A reminder that when power seeks to dominate the most intimate corners of human life, it leaves behind nothing but ruins, shame, and silence. The harem may have died with the empires that built them, but their darkness still breathes. in history, and in us.